Hey everybody, welcome to the narrated PowerPoint. I actually already recorded this once in its entirety and it didn't work. So I'm going to try it again here and I apologize for the late posting. But when I went and checked the YouTube video for the original recording, there was no sound. So I'm going to go ahead and redo it right now. So if you were here in class on January 26th, which was the night of the ice storm, you can go ahead and skip part 1 of this presentation and start with part 2 of the classic fairy tales because you guys already got this information. But if you weren't in class, you'll want to go ahead and sit through this one before you move on to parts 2 and 3. So the first thing that we can just start by thinking about is the fact that we all know fairy tales by heart, and you've probably never stopped to really consider which tales it is that you know and sort of how it is that you came to know these tales. How did you learn them? And one thing that we, of course, didn't have a chance to discuss in class because of the ice storm, with everyone at least, was just sort of what did you think about the classic versions of the fairy tales? Of course, as you know, they're quite different from the Disney versions that we're all familiar with. Most of the Disney versions tend to really sanitize the fairy tales. They take out all the scary, sort of gruesome, graphic bits that we're confronted with in the original versions. And I'll be very curious to hear just sort of what your reactions were to Cinderella's stepsisters chopping off their toes. So one of the first things we need to do is define what is a fairy tale. So there's a definition here from Marcia Lane, and she defines a fairy tale as a story that's literary or folk with a sense of the numinous, the feeling or sensation of the supernatural or the mysterious. And I think that's really true. If you think about all the fairy tales we are familiar with, they do have those sensations of supernaturality and mystery about them. But there are some other ways that we can sort of begin to define exactly what a fairy tale is. And one of those ways is by defining what a fairy tale is not. And the first thing that a fairy tale is not is it's not a myth. It doesn't tell the origins of the life or the world in the same way that a myth does. And if you think about different cultures throughout history, many cultures have stories for kind of how the world or the universe or people came to be. Those are myths, and a fairy tale is not the same thing as a myth. Fairy tales also are not legends, and legends are tales of a quote-unquote real person. You might think about King Arthur, and in legends there probably are some buried bits of truth hidden in there, but it becomes wrapped in more details, and we may not know what's sort of the fact and the fiction in a legend. And again, a fairy tale doesn't contain any sort of glean of reality about it normally. Fantasies are often a tale of the imaginary past in a real setting. Again, fairy tales don't normally fit those parameters. And they also don't fit the parameters of science fiction, what we sometimes call sci-fi. Usually sci-fi is a tale of the future. It often has a scientific theme. You know, one of the classic examples of a sci-fi story would be anything involving time travel, right? And then finally, a fairy tale is not the same thing as a narrative theology. So when we're talking about narrative theology, we're talking about religious tales such as the Passion of Jesus Christ and other religious stories that you may be familiar with. So none of those things are the same as fairy tales. And the definitions of these different types of stories would be really good to know for the midterm exam. So there are some defining traits of fairy tales. Now that we know what they aren't, let's talk about what they are. So some characteristics that might reveal to you that a story is a fairy tale are the generic world with the fantastic elements, restricted magic, stock characters, and the journey or quest plot elements. So let's start with the first one. If you think about how many fairy tales begin, it's often with a line, something along the lines of, a long time ago in a faraway land. And other than that, we normally don't get much description. So if you try to imagine the world that Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood or Molly Whuppie live in, it seems to be just sort of a generic bland world. And within that bland world, fantastic elements stand out. And when I say fantastic, I don't mean it the way we use it in the common parlance, which is to say that something is awesome, right? Or like that it's really super cool. When I say fantastic here, I mean it quite literally. It has elements of fantasy in it. Fairy tales often also have the use of restricted magic. So there's something magical that happens, but it's not just this wild magic that can do anything at all. So for example, the young girl has to go cry under the tree and water the ground with her tears, and then suddenly there's a magical dress that is shaken down from the branches. So there's that restricted magic that you'll see. Fairy tales also often feature stock characters. These are, you can sort of think of them as generic characters. There's the good guy, there's the bad guy, there's the wizard, there's the evil queen or the evil stepmother. You'll oftentimes see these sort of generic stock characters in fairy tales. And then finally, fairy tales also often have a journey or a quest plot element. So a character maybe physically journeys somewhere or sets out on an actual quest, maybe to do something or to gain something. Or the journey could also be more of a metaphorical journey. So it might be kind of an emotional or intellectual journey that the hero goes on. Now, some common traits of fairy tales are that they bear the marks of oral tradition. So fairy tales come down to us from oral stories. When people weren't literate and didn't know how to read and write, we still wanted to share these stories with each other, but since we weren't able to write them down yet, they had to be able to be told through words, right? And those types of stories are called orature. That's spelled Orature. Again, another good term to know for exams. And orature and literature both tell stories, but of course orature is told orally. Now, as you know, if you're trying to tell a story, sometimes it can be hard to remember, which is why, as you see on the screen here, fairy tales often include repetition. They'll have repetitive descriptions, repetitive dialogue, and repetitive plot elements. So you might think about how the evil queen tries to kill Snow White several times. You might think about the dialogue between Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, right? Oh my, Grandma, what big ears you have, the better to hear you with. What big eyes you have, the better to see you with. Well, the reason that dialogue is repetitive is because it has come to us from something that was originally an oral story, that was originally orature. So those repetitive elements, again, are good indicators that you may be looking at a fairy tale. So some discussion questions we might just think about, and of course we would have talked about these in class, but you can just sort of think about them right now, are what are the differing roles of men and women in the fairy tales? How are they represented, and are those representations fair or unfair? How do these tales differ from the Disney version? Do you find the Disney versions to be better, to be worse? And should children read these tales? And if so, what version should they be exposed to? So we're going to stop this PowerPoint right here, and the next one will begin by talking about some of the famous collectors of fairy tales.